Hello and welcome to another edition of Yakety Yak, and our thanks tonight to our hosts, Investec. Tonight's guest is Andrea Durbach. Andrea was born and raised in South Africa and was practicing there as a political trial lawyer and human rights advocate when, with only a few years' experience, she was appointed attorney to a group of 25 black defendants in a notorious death penalty case. Andrea later published an account of her experiences in that time, which was shortlisted for the Alan Paton Award for Non-Fiction. Andrea later moved to Australia and has held since then a dizzying array of roles in commissions, tribunals and councils in human rights and related fields. In 2004, Andrea took up a joint appointment as Associate Professor and Director of the Australian Human Rights Centre at the University of New South Wales Faculty of Law. Last year, a documentary film based on Andrea's book, entitled A Common Purpose, won the Audience Award for Best Documentary at the Sydney Film Festival. To help us explore Andrea's fascinating life, our interviewer tonight, as always, Peter Thompson.
Well, Andrea, there's been some exciting talking heads and certainly some exciting yakety yaks over the last 3 years. You've spent half your life in Australia, or a little less than half your life, so we want to start where you began, in South Africa. And you might recall for me you going with your mother. She was a journalist, a freelance journalist, to talk to people that were disadvantaged by apartheid. What's your impression? What memories do you have?
Well, I was fairly young, and I remember going with her particularly to a community that were being moved out under the Group Areas Act in South Africa at the time. A coloured community, as we named them, moved out of a white area, and their homes were about to be bulldozed and they were to be shunted out of the city. And I remember just watching her talk to these people and listen to the fear and the horror and the sadness that they were about to experience. And a sense of just overwhelming helplessness, I think, was the feeling, but also a sense that my mother was trying to somehow denounce it. She couldn't fix it, but perhaps denounce it through the media, through writing about it. And as a young child, I think that left a huge impression. That would look like to me people who were particularly sort of ordinary, vulnerable people being treated in this way just didn't make sense.
She must have walked a very fine line down what was acceptable and what wasn't acceptable in terms of what she could write.
Well, I think looking back on it now, and I wasn't aware of it at that age, but looking back on it, I think what was permissible, if we can say, about her writings is that she wrote about very ordinary lives and ordinary stories without any political edge to it. And that's how she got it in. She was a feature journalist, and she simply wrote about people's lives and the impact of apartheid on their lives. And I think that's how she probably got permitted to publish the work that she did, the stories that
Another
she did.
key influence on you was your cousin, Bill, who was at one time president of the Union of South African Students.
Yes.
And he was quite political.
He was overtly political. He was an endocrinologist. He was in the medical school at the University of Cape Town. When I knew him, he had spoken out a couple of times as the honorary president of the National Union of South African Students, and in fact had brought defamation proceedings against the Minister of Justice, who said something pretty awful about Bill, which went to his credibility at a number of levels, and Bill was brave enough to bring defamation proceedings, and the next we heard he was placed under house arrest and basically banished from society. Well, he managed to get out on an exit permit. He was invited to England to a post there. But I remember going to visit him with police cars going around his home, and only one person at a time could speak to him. And he was in that situation probably for 2 years before it became utterly untenable.
So what impact did Bill have on you?
Well, for me, he represented such a just, humane individual, and somehow he was cast in the light of someone who was doing wrong. And again, that didn't seem to make sense to me. I was 7 at the time, I remember, and I think the pain of seeing him leave the country and my mother see someone who she was very close to leave, all these students, I remember going to the airport to bid him farewell, and there were thousands and thousands of students at the airport, high above with black armbands singing "We Shall Overcome" as he left, and a big, huge white South African policeman with police dogs snarling around him as he was trying to get through the crowd, and turning to my father, who was shaking Bill's hand and saying, "We'll be so pleased when this bastard leaves the country." And it was that bastard who basically got me to study law. I'm convinced of it, because it was such a formative experience of seeing someone who was so concerned with justice be treated so unjustly.
Your father was a man of values.
Yeah, my dad was. He wasn't a political animal. My mother was the political animal in the family, but my dad, I think, had very strong sense of what was right and wrong, and he deliberated about things. He was someone who thought through things, and I think my mother probably turned him into a political animal, but he was someone he had strong moral centre.
Well, all of this added up to you obviously becoming an actress. That's what you were going to do.
I wanted to become an actress.
You would have been good at it.
But I think there was something appealing about law, because I was interested in justice, of course, but also that sense that you stepped into somebody else's shoes when you represented them, and you had to convey with conviction and with passion their story and convince a court. But I also remember when I told my father that I decided not to go to drama school, but to go and study law, his complete confidence in me when he said, "Well, at least if you're a second-rate lawyer, at least you'll still get a job."
What role did your Jewish ancestry play in the person you were becoming at that stage in your teens?
Yeah, I don't really know. You know, a lot of my mother's side of the family had actually converted to Catholicism, so I was raised in a strange mix of kind of cultural and religious values, but I think they were probably very important for me because they demonstrated the value of diversity. And but I think my father was quite religious, and I'm pretty sure that somehow those values seeped through. But I also think the fact that he fought in the Second World War, and I heard stories of the Holocaust and of the horrors of it, I'm sure would have somehow permeated and influenced my being or my decisions about what to do with my life. But I think there were so many factors that being Jewish was simply one of them.
Later on you reflect and say that in South Africa you had a choice really of either being involved in the campaign against apartheid or being complicit.
Yes, and you know, for me that was just there was no decision really. You either had to do something about the horrors and use your skills and your expertise and your financial position, and we were all beneficiaries of it, whether we were liberal beneficiaries or not. But there was something about studying law and then the idea of practicing law in South Africa which did worry me, because if I was going to practice as a lawyer, I would be, in a sense, executing the laws of the country, many of which I didn't agree with. And so there was this concern within me that by doing that I would be complicit in a system that I abhorred. I had, however, a wonderful teacher, a law teacher, who encouraged me to use my skills and to use the law as a sword and a shield at the same time, to crack open, he used to say, try and use it to crack open this edifice that is apartheid and find the loopholes in the law that bring justice or bring remedy. This
transition from being the actress in the making to being a lawyer really was heavily influenced by you going to the United States on an exchange program, where you actually had the good fortune of spending time with a 9-time congressman.
Yeah.
He was the person that persuaded you to do law.
Yes, well, here was this white kid. I'd never been out of South Africa before, and I arrived on Long Island in New York. I worked over the summer for this Democratic congressman, Otis Pike, and I became aware through his teachings and my conversations with him of a Bill of Rights that I'd never knew about.
I should say Otis Pike chaired a House committee, which was looking at the relationship between the White House and the CIA. Right. So he was really into the sort of the teeth of very interesting politics himself. He was no ordinary congressman.
No, he wasn't, and he played the ukulele beautifully as well.
I didn't know that.
But I think also, and being in America at quite a sort of ordinary, I was in the duck capital of the world on Long Island called Eastport, you know, and there were black kids at my school, and there were white people cleaning the streets. I thought, my goodness, that's amazing. So suddenly I was opened to issues around class and race that I hadn't experienced in South Africa. And I actually was opened to a society that looked to be quite viable in terms of how a functioning democracy and a non-racial democracy, certainly at one level, could operate. So I was, and of course going into New York and being able to read whatever I wanted to. You know, books were banned in South Africa. Black Beauty was banned in South Africa.
Well, for obvious reasons.
Yeah. You couldn't read at university. We couldn't read Marx. You know, we couldn't read anything that was related to communism. Movies were banned. The Beatles were banned because they said they were greater than Christ. And you know, South Africa being a God-fearing country, they couldn't tolerate that. So suddenly I was exposed to a life and a world that was incredibly exciting and stimulating.
And not only in the United States, but also in Britain, where you later studied. Part of your legal studies were at the University of Warwick, which was quite a radical.
It was
university in those days.
It was considered a red brick university, and I remember arriving there and going for a drink with some friends and going into what was called the Nelson Mandela Bar and thinking, goodness, am I allowed in here? It's called something that you know, a man in my country is in prison for this name, and suddenly to be with students from all over Africa was also amazing. There were students from Nigeria and Ghana and Rwanda and the Congo and Kenya, and as a white South African, we were not really considered part of Africa. In fact, most of Africa wouldn't allow white South Africans entry into their country. So suddenly I was aware that I was an Africanist for the first time, and that was part of this continent that for me had more to do with Britain than with Africa, and more links with Europe than with Africa.
Were you tempted at the time to go down the academic path rather than the practicing path?
I did for a while. When I left, when I completed my law degree, I did lecture, and then I went, largely because I had this dilemma about being complicit if I practiced with the apartheid system, and that's why I did go to Warwick University. But I actually was terribly irritated, she says now an academic, by the academic world. I found it insular and isolated, and I actually wanted to use my law degree to make an impact and to contribute in some way. I wasn't really that interested in theory. I've become more interested in theory as I've grown older.
So you joined a law firm that actually, part of which represented Nelson Mandela, is that right?
That's right.
So a quite politicised law firm to begin with.
Yeah.
And then 2 years later you find yourself confronted by the possibility of joining the defence for the Upington 25. Before we began this conversation, I got Andy to actually run through the Upington 25, and I think we should do it again, because we'll make it brief, but it's a complex and very important case. These 25 people were convicted of murder under a doctrine called common purpose, so you might explain.
So there were 25 black people convicted of the murder of a black policeman who was regarded by many as a traitor. He became a policeman because of poverty. He was driven into it. The common purpose doctrine is a doctrine more usually used in a bank robbery case, for example, where a number of people will come together, plan to rob a bank. One of them takes a gun. In the robbing of the Bank of Malay, that is consequential. They use the gun, someone gets killed. All three are then held liable for the murder of the person who gets killed, because they should have foreseen that would have happened. Bank robbery, unlawful conduct, a gun, shoot the gun, someone is liable to get killed. It's a reasonably foreseeable consequence of their actions. In this instance, there were 3,000 people who gathered on a soccer field one morning to demonstrate against the harsh brutality of the police, high degrees of alcoholism in the community, no electricity, no running water, just grievances. The police arrived on the scene. It was 6 o'clock in the morning, gave this crowd a few minutes to disperse, 3,000 people, a few minutes to disperse, They then sang a prayer and the national anthem, and while they were singing the prayer, the police started shooting tear gas canisters, which to the human ear sounds like live ammunition. And the crowd panicked. They then gathered, a couple of them in their dispersing, gathered outside the home of this young policeman, Lucas Setwala. He shot into the crowd because he panicked and wounded, paralyzed a little boy standing on the outskirts of the crowd. They then followed him, took his gun from him, hit him over the head, and then unfortunately set him alight, as was called a necklace killing in South Africa at the time. 26 people were arrested. 6 of the 26 were simply fill-ins on an identity parade. They weren't suspects, they were fill-ins on the identity parade. But they were then designated as suspects in the 26. And after a long, long trial, 25 of the 26 were convicted of the murder under the common purpose doctrine. The judge saying that them coming together, even though they came together spontaneously, many of them didn't even know one another, they formed an intention to kill. So he said they formed a group, a collective intention, which under criminal law is erroneous. You can only have individual intention. You don't know what someone else is intending to do. But he said that that intention was manifested in them throwing stones at the policeman's house in order to drive him from his house so they could kill him.
So you join at the time of the appeal?
No, I joined at the time that they've just been convicted of murder,
Right.
and they're about to be sentenced to the mandatory death sentence, which was applicable in South Africa at the time, unless you could demonstrate extenuating circumstances. So that's the next phase of the trial. The appeal comes at the 4th stage. So you do conviction, extenuation, mitigation of sentence, then appeal.
And the majority of those are sentenced to death?
14 of the 25 are sentenced to death after a 2-year, probably the biggest trial in extenuation in Africa, to try and get them the court not to impose the death penalty.
Part of that preparation for the appeal process is done in Australia.
Yes, it is. After 14 of my clients were sentenced to death, my barrister, Anton Lebowski, who I was very close to, was assassinated. And there was a point at which, it might have something to do with his involvement in the trial, but he was also about to become the new Attorney General in an independent Southwest Africa, Namibia. He was shot by a mercenary 9 times and killed on the day that I got back from a trip overseas where I was garnering support from European and English and Irish governments to exert pressure on the South African government not to impose the death penalty. And he was killed the day I got back, and it was the same day that I heard that we'd been granted leave to appeal the case. And so I ran the appeal, having to bring in a new barrister, in fact a team of barristers, and we were successful on appeal, very luckily.
One of the key issues you needed to argue was what is a psychological theory called de-individuation. You might just explain that and why that actually became a problem for many of those who had claimed that they weren't on the scene.
Yeah.
They used, in fact, an alibi of not being present as their defence.
Yes, all of my clients said in the period of the trial on conviction where I didn't represent them, they pleaded an alibi defence, as you say. But the state witnesses actually proved to the court that they were on the scene. So instead of saying, I was there but I didn't kill someone, they said, I wasn't there at all. And that was very typical of black accused in apartheid South Africa. There's a sort of culture of denial, which I think was very prevalent, where people said they just denied any kind of involvement or presence because they knew that simply being black was already something against them. So they denied, instead of saying I was there but I didn't do anything, they didn't think they would be believed. So they said I wasn't there, but they were placed on the scene by state witnesses. When I came into the case to try and prevent the death penalty from being imposed, we then had to say to them, look, the court has found you to be there. You have to tell us why you did what you did so we can find extenuating circumstances. Were you provoked? Were you angered? Was it your political situation or your economic situation that compelled you to behave in a certain way on that day? And they said, but we weren't there. They wouldn't budge. And short of sort of pushing them over the edge, which I almost had to do as their lawyer. And we even told them we would get Nelson Mandela in and they could confide in him, or Bishop Tutu, because I was desperate to save these people from the death penalty. They refused. So what we had to do was create profiles of these people using psychologists, clinical psychologists, behavioral psychologists, forensic scientists, anthropologists, criminologists, to create these profiles of these people who interviewed them, in a sense, off camera. So they weren't before the court telling the court what they felt on the day, but we used experts to tell the court what they discovered in their research of these people, in their interviews of these people. And one of the theories was the de-individuation theory, as you say, that people, when they are in a crowd environment, 3,000 people, it's hot, it was 40 degrees on the day, police arrive, open fire, that people lose their normal inhibitions and act in ways very contrary to how they would normally act because of the forces of the crowd that were at play on the day. Plus, these are people who have a history of deprivation. So that there was a powder keg ready to explode on the day. These are people who were angry, who had been oppressed for most of their lives, and then the police come in and shoot into a crowd while they're saying a prayer and singing the national anthem. It was going to end badly.
So the highest court in the land overturns the death penalties, and the sentences are converted to, in some cases, community service.
Prison terms. So, sorry, it is complicated, Peter, but when after the trial and extenuation, 14 of the 25 were sentenced to death, and others got prison terms, and others got community sentence. So it was the madness of that place that they were all convicted of the same crime on the same standards applied, but because of certain factors that the court decided were relevant, namely youth, but not old age, because a couple in their late 60s were actually sentenced to death. A few of my clients actually were allowed to do community service as their punishment, while others were sent to death row.
Let's bring in the second part of the story, the Australian chapter of it. How did you heal yourself after that experience?
I didn't think I needed healing. There's a part of me that thought I could cope and I was fine and life goes on. And 7 years later, I was at a dinner with a friend of mine from South Africa, and we were talking about the trial, and the next day I actually ended up in St. Vincent's thinking I'd had a heart attack. But it was the beginning of panic attacks. And that's when I realized that I needed to be healed, and that I had obviously repressed a lot of these horrendous experiences because I just felt one gets on with it. I'm white, I'm privileged, I get on with it. I've seen black people live far more destructive lives, and so I did repress it. But I went to see a doctor. I was moved from cardiologist to neurologist. There was nothing wrong with me, but I did go and see a doctor who actually was the only doctor who said, "What have you done in the last 10 years because your body's presenting of post-traumatic stress?" And when I told him, I said to him, "Why after 7 years does it suddenly explode?" And he said this very beautiful thing to me, which I almost called my book after what he said, but I thought it was too kind of sentimental. But he said, because the body is the last to weep. And it's only when you're ready that the body starts to. And I think Australia allowed me to just be, as opposed to a South Africa, apartheid South Africa, which imposed this sort of my own sense of obligation that I had to do all the time.
Like many South Africans, you first came here because of family being here,
Yeah.
and your brother Neil being here,
Yeah.
and had established a successful highly successful architectural firm. But you took up the temptation of legal work and worked for a time with Freehills. Not for long though, and that was you were to join the Public Interest Advocacy Centre and spend a long time there.
Yeah, I was there for, Freehills was a wonderful experience. I re-qualified as a new lawyer, as an Australian lawyer, but I also met some wonderful people there, and they remained part of my legal life, and still do. And when I went to PIAC, and I was there for 13 years. It was as a consequence of my being at Freehills when I established the Public Interest Law Clearinghouse, which was the pro bono arm of PIAC, where we invited the private legal profession in to do public interest work for free. The first people I went to talk about this model to were Freehills, and Freehills were the first people to join. And of course then I could go to Mallesons and say, hey, Freehills have joined, you better, and then do the same with everybody else. So I stayed in the legal world. I refined my legal training and my skills and honed them, I think, very much when I was at Freehills, and then went back into the world where I felt I belonged, really, which was the public interest world and the community world.
Well, the public interest world is very much on the Centre for Social Impact's agenda. It's where the focus is. And broadly speaking, let's call your legal interest human rights. I know that is a very broad brush, that you're interested in human rights in so many ways. What is the importance to you of the third sector? What role can the third sector play in human rights issues rather than these things being left to government?
I think they're critical, absolutely critical. Non-profit organisations or NGOs go to places where government fear to go. They make visible what is often invisible. And they, I think, have an amazing ability to talk the language of the community or the locale in which they operate, which government often doesn't have the skills to do. But they're then able to translate that into policy or into advocacy or into campaigns. And I recently was at a lecture by a man called Stephen Lewis, a Canadian advocate on HIV/AIDS. So, he's been doing this work, extraordinary work, for decades. And he was saying he travels the world and there are these amazing NGOs doing wonderful work in the HIV/AIDS and global health world. And yet they struggle financially to do the work that they've been set up to do. And he cannot understand why government doesn't actually fund them properly, because they are doing such important work for government, actually. And if they could be seen as partners with government and partners in social democracy and initiatives around social democracy, government would benefit enormously. But he's constantly confounded by how these organizations have to struggle for their survival. And I've recently been back in South Africa, and it's not a terrific environment at the moment at all. It's letting lots of people down. But the level of engagement in community and the NGO world is just remarkable, and the energy, it's electrifying. And I just think, my God, if we didn't have that strata doing that sort of work, the world would soon collapse. And I really mean that. It holds the world up in many ways. It holds people to account. It brings redress to people that government cannot reach for some reason. It does amazing, that sector does amazing work, and I'm utterly in awe of it.
Those dozen or so years that you're involved in PIAC and the Clearinghouse, the Advocacy Centre and the Clearinghouse, what do you feel proudest of? What were you able to achieve?
I think the Clearinghouse was a great initiative. I think also our work with the Stolen Generations was important. I came to Australia, and because of my work in South Africa, there was a kind of assumption that I would dive into the world of Indigenous struggle, and I was very cautious not to, because I don't think struggles just translate, or you can transplant one kind of one aspect of one's participation in community to another. And so I observed the Indigenous struggle for a long time before I did work there, and it was really around the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's work and the Canadians and the New Zealanders that I started to explore that maybe going to court, and I loved litigating, that maybe going to court on behalf of the Stolen Generations wasn't an appropriate thing to do. And that what we should be doing is calling on government in the light of the Bringing Them Home report to set up a Stolen Generations Reparations Tribunal, to properly compensate the Stolen Generations, to properly apologise, to properly restore what they'd lost in terms of culture and language and identity and land. And drawing on all these international models, we developed a major project, and in fact there was a Senate inquiry into setting up something like a reparations tribunal, and the government of the day, the Labour government, said that the template that we'd devised was the template that they would like to use in setting in place this framework. But there was a change of government, and so it came to naught. But I'm happy to say that a lot of the state governments have now implemented something similar, not completely along the lines that we advocate, but something similar in terms of compensation schemes for the stolen generations. I think the work that we did around the AIS case, the biggest discrimination case in Australian history, was very important. This was about establishing jobs for women and raising the bar of allowing women entry into the workplace. It changed legislation, it changed conduct within big corporations. It was against BHP, excuse me, the biggest corporation in Australia, and we had 700 women, mostly from non-English speaking backgrounds, take them on. And we changed the law and reformed occupational health and safety policies around that. So that was also extremely important. I think setting up the homeless persons legal service was another very important initiative within PIAC. There are lots of things I'm proud of, and I think I'm proud of the fact that I worked and most delighted that I worked with some remarkable people who were able to kind of execute ideas in the way that they did.
Well, after a long stay there, you did become an academic.
I did.
You joined the University of New South Wales Law Faculty and revived the Human Rights Centre there. So that's, you actually shifted full circle, really.
I've come full circle, yes. And I think it was an invitation to join the law faculty that I couldn't resist. I swore that I would never run another centre and went straight into running another centre. But
your experience that.
But I think the challenge of it was exciting. But also running PIAC and doing litigation and policy work, I had got to a point after 13 or 14 years where I felt that I'd started to skim the surface, and that made me uncomfortable. Because of the pressures of work, I felt that I was sort of skimming the surface of a lot of things, and that I wanted to go back into being more reflective and observing and having the time to do that. Not having to manage 40 people or 30 people every day, but having and raise funds for the organisation, but just stepping back and reflecting and researching. And that's, I think, the pull of academia. I'm not a terribly good academic. I don't really know how to be one yet. I'm still learning. I love teaching. I love the experience of working with students. The centre's brought enormous opportunities, and to be able to do research in an in-depth way, and to use that research hopefully to then feed back into community is very important to me. So I've managed to justify to myself, I think, why going back into academia is appropriate.
One final question on the Australian scene, and that is Liz Broderick stepped aside from the Australian Human Rights Commission to actually do the defence inquiry, one of the defence inquiries, which gave you the opportunity to step into her role in an acting sense as the Deputy Sex Discrimination Commissioner. And you had a particular focus on violence against women.
Yeah. It was a marvellous opportunity. I was appointed to the role for 1 year while Liz, as you said, did her inquiry. And I say this to all my colleagues and my dean, that I think academics should have these opportunities to go back into community and to do research in community and to work with government, which I did a lot. And I, as you said, was mostly working around the issue of violence against women, and I travelled around Australia with the UN Special Rapporteur on violence against women, Rashida Manjoo, and we spoke to women from Indigenous communities, women from migrant and refugee communities, women with disability, and uncovered a very, very disturbing story about the extent and the pervasiveness of violence against women in this country. 1 in 5 women, a conservative estimate, will experience some form of violence in their lifetime over the age of 15. We heard testimony from women with disability who were assaulted and abused by carers. We also heard from them how their stories weren't believed because they were told that they didn't feel the abuse in the same way as people who were not disabled. We heard from migrant women and refugee women that they were told that the violence they were experiencing was part of their culture, so they should just get on with it. And similarly in indigenous communities. So the pervasiveness, the violence seems to be getting more violent. So it was a very alarming, but I have to say we have now pulled it into a beautiful project, a very exciting project at the Commission, and we were now trying to lobby the government and campaign with the government to introduce domestic violence as a new ground of discrimination in Australian law.
You've always dealt with very difficult cases. You've spent a lifetime doing it. Are you an optimist?
Absolutely. Yes, I think I am. I mean, of course I have my down times where I just think, goodness, you know, is there any point to any of this? When things are so tough for people and the odds are so high. But, you know, I think humour and laughter is very important in the world in which I work, and that's what makes me think there is something that is attainable, and we've demonstrated it. You know, we've succeeded. There've been huge defeats, but wonderful victories, and I think that's what keeps us going. And so yes, I think optimism is very close to my heart. And you know, I love what I do. I didn't imagine work could be like this. It's wonderful that you can work in a world where the kind of what you believe in and what you feel concerned about, kind of there's a congruency with what you do 9 to 5.
9 to 5, yes. Andrea Durbach, it's been a pleasure talking to you. Thank you very much indeed.
Thanks, Peter.